She was just another commercial pilot flying a routine 737 from Dallas to LA. But when her distress call went out using a call sign that hadn't been heard in 20 years, 2 F-22 Raptor pilots nearly fell out of the sky. Ghost Rider requesting emergency escort. The voice was female, young, impossible. Because Ghost Rider had died in combat 2 decades ago. Before you dive into this story, tell me, which country are you from? Comment below. Subscribe now because tomorrow I'm dropping the best story yet. You don't want to miss it. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her headset as she guided the Boeing 737 through the early morning sky at 37,000 feet. 28 years old, she was one of the youngest captains flying for Southwest Airlines, a fact that still earned her double takes from passengers and occasional skepticism from older crew members. Her first officer today was Tom Bradley, a veteran with silver hair and 15,000 flight hours who had initially been less than thrilled to fly under a captain young enough to be his daughter. Weather looks good all the way to LAX, Tom said, scanning the instruments with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Should be a smooth ride. Sarah nodded, her eyes moving across the flight displays with practiced precision. She had worked incredibly hard to get here, earning her commercial license at 19, building hours as a flight instructor, working her way through regional airlines, and finally landing her dream job with a major carrier. Every flight was a reminder that she had made it, that all the sacrifices had been worth it. What Tom and the passengers didn't know was that Sarah had grown up differently than most pilots. Her father, Colonel James Ghost Rider Mitchell, had been a legendary F-15 fighter pilot, an ace who had flown combat missions in 2 wars and trained an entire generation of fighter pilots at Top Gun. His call sign had become famous in military aviation circles, representing excellence, courage, and an almost supernatural ability to handle any situation in the air. Then, 20 years ago, during a routine training exercise over the Nevada desert, his aircraft had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Colonel Mitchell had stayed with his dying plane long enough to steer it away from a populated area before ejecting. But something went wrong with the ejection sequence. He didn't survive. Sarah had been 8 years old. She kept a photo of him in her flight bag, wearing his flight suit, standing in front of his F-15, the Ghost Rider insignia visible on the fuselage. She had never told anyone at the airline about her father, preferring to build her career on her own merits rather than trading on his legacy. But she carried his lessons with her every day, his voice in her head teaching her about situational awareness, decision-making under pressure, and the absolute necessity of staying calm when everything went wrong. Southwest 2847, this is Los Angeles Center. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through her headset. We're showing weather developing along your route. Advise you deviate right, heading 270. Roger, Center, Southwest 2847 turning right to 270, Sarah responded, banking the aircraft smoothly. Behind her in the cabin, 132 passengers barely noticed the gentle turn, most absorbed in their phones, books, or trying to catch some sleep on the early morning flight. That's when everything changed. The first indication was a shudder that ran through the airframe, subtle but wrong. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the throttles as her eyes scanned the instruments. Engine pressure readings were fluctuating on engine number 1. Before she could say anything, a master caution light illuminated. Engine 1 showing abnormal readings, Tom said, his casual tone gone, replaced by focused professionalism. Pressures dropping, temperature rising. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Engine fire checklist, stand by. But before she could reach for the checklist, a loud bang resonated through the aircraft. The plane yawed hard to the left as Engine 1's failure became catastrophic. Passengers screamed as overhead bins popped open and the aircraft shook violently. Engine fire, number 1. Tom called out. We've got flames. Sarah fought the controls, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Engine 1 fire handle, pull. Tom pulled the T-shaped handle, cutting fuel and hydraulics to the failing engine and discharging the first fire suppression bottle. But the fire warning didn't extinguish. Fire's not out, Tom said, tension creeping into his voice. Discharging second bottle. He rotated the handle and pressed again. The fire warning persisted. Then things got worse. Much worse. We're losing hydraulic pressure, Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. System A is gone. System B is fluctuating. She glanced at the flight controls, feeling them becoming heavy, less responsive. The shrapnel from the engine failure must have damaged the hydraulic lines running along the wing route. Southwest 2847 Los Angeles Center, we're showing your transponder code for emergency. State your intentions. Sarah keyed her mic, Center, Southwest 2847, we've had an uncontained engine failure on number 1 with fire that won't suppress. We're losing hydraulics and need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Declaring emergency. Roger 2847, closest airport is Edwards Air Force Base, 40 miles northwest of your position. I'm contacting them now for emergency clearance. Squawk 7700. Edwards. Her father's old base. The place where he had trained, where he had taught others, where his legend had been born. Sarah pushed the thought aside and focused on keeping the aircraft flying. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. We've lost System B hydraulics, Tom announced. System C is all we have left and it's showing degraded pressure. Sarah felt it in the controls. The 737 was becoming sluggish, fighting her inputs. With only one engine and degraded hydraulics, they were in serious trouble. She needed to get this aircraft on the ground and fast. Center, Southwest 2847, we need priority handling. We're losing flight controls. Roger 2847, you're cleared direct Edwards, descend and maintain flight level 250. I've notified Edwards Command, they're rolling emergency equipment and clearing the airspace. As Sarah began the descent, another voice came over the radio, different from the air traffic controller. This one was sharp, military, overlaid with the slight distortion of a tactical radio. Southwest 2847, this is Viper 11, a flight of 2 F-22s out of Edwards. We've been scrambled to escort you in. We're coming up on your 6 o'clock, 5 miles. Sarah glanced out her window and saw them, 2 of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, climbing toward her position with incredible speed. Within seconds they pulled alongside, 1 on each wing, close enough that she could see the pilots in their cockpits. Southwest 2847, Viper 11 has visual, the lead F-22 pilot said. We can see damage to your left engine and wing. There's still smoke trailing. How's your controllability? Degraded and getting worse, Sarah replied. I've got limited hydraulics and I'm basically steering this thing with one engine and prayers. Copy that. We're going to stay with you all the way down. Edwards has rolled every piece of emergency equipment on base. You've got 16,000 feet of runway waiting for you. Sarah fought the controls as the aircraft descended. The automation was failing, forcing her to hand-fly the crippled Boeing with degrading hydraulics. Every input required more force, and the aircraft's response was delayed and imprecise. Beside her, Tom worked through emergency checklists, shutting down non-essential systems to preserve what little hydraulic pressure remained. Southwest 2847 Edwards Tower, you're cleared to land any runway. Winds are calm. Emergency equipment is standing by. Roger Edwards, Sarah said, her voice strained as she wrestled with the controls. The runway was in sight now, but she was coming in too fast and too high with limited ability to adjust her approach. That's when the third hydraulic system failed completely. That's it, Tom said, his voice tight. All hydraulics are gone. Sarah, we have no flight controls. The yoke in Sarah's hands became dead weight. The pedals wouldn't move. They were flying a 200,000-pound aircraft with no way to steer it except the thrust from their remaining engine. It was a scenario that had killed crews before, an almost unrecoverable emergency. In that moment, with death approaching at 300 miles per hour, with 132 passengers behind her counting on her to save them, Sarah heard her father's voice from 20 years ago. They had been in his home simulator and he was teaching her about asymmetric thrust control, a technique so advanced that most commercial pilots never learned it. Listen to me, his voice echoed in her memory. If you ever lose all hydraulics, the only thing you have left is your engines. You can steer with thrust alone, but it takes finesse. Add power to turn one way, reduce it to turn the other. Use tiny adjustments. Feel the aircraft, don't fight it. Sarah keyed her radio and for the first time in 20 years, a call sign that had been retired spoke again. Viper 11, this is Ghost Rider. I've lost all flight controls. I'm going to attempt a thrust-only landing. I need you to talk me through this approach because I'm coming in fast and I only get one shot. There was a long silence on the radio. Then the F-22 pilot's voice came back, but it had changed. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by shock and something else, emotion. Say again your call sign? Ghost Rider, Sarah repeated, her hands on the throttles, making micro-adjustments to keep the aircraft level. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. I'm his daughter. Captain Sarah Mitchell. My dad was Colonel James Mitchell. He taught me everything, including how to fly when you've got nothing left but engines and guts. Another voice broke in, this one from the second F-22. Ghost Rider, this is Viper 12. I trained under your father at Nellis. He was the best pilot I ever knew. If you're half the pilot he was, you're going to make this landing. Roger that, Viper 1-2, Sarah said, and despite the terror and the impossible situation, she felt a surge of determination. Let's prove that Ghost Rider's daughter can fly. The F-22 pilots bracketed her aircraft, calling out altitudes, airspeeds, and distances to the runway. Sarah worked the throttle for the remaining engine like a sculptor working clay, adding power to lift the nose, reducing it to let it fall, using thrust vectoring in ways that weren't in any commercial pilot's manual but that her father had drilled into her during countless hours in his simulator. You're high and fast, Ghost Rider, Viper 1-1 called. Recommend you deploy your gear now, use the drag to slow down. Sarah reached for the landing gear lever and pulled it. The gear dropped with mechanical thunder, creating massive drag that pulled the nose down sharply. She countered with a burst of power, finding the delicate balance. 3 miles out, Viper 1-2 called. You're on glide path. Airspeed 190 knots. That's fast, but you're lined up. The runway filled her windscreen. Sarah's hands moved constantly on the throttle, making adjustments every second. Too much power and she'd balloon over the runway. Too little and she'd drop like a stone. She had to hit the narrow window where she could get the aircraft on the ground in one piece. 1 mile, Ghost Rider. You've got this. Tom beside her had gone silent, his hands gripping the armrests. In the cabin, flight attendants had the passengers in brace positions. Everyone knew this was going to be rough. Sarah saw the runway threshold approaching and made her final adjustments. She added a burst of power to arrest the descent rate, then cut it at the last second. The main gear hit the concrete with tremendous force, blowing both tires instantly. The aircraft bounced, came down again, and Sarah fought to keep it centered using only differential thrust. The nose gear slammed down. They were on the ground but traveling at over 150 knots with no brakes, no steering, just momentum and physics. Sarah cut the remaining engine completely and watched the end of the 16,000-foot runway rushing toward them. Come on, she whispered. Come on, slow down. The aircraft began to decelerate, friction and drag doing their work. 8,000 feet of runway left. 6,000. 4,000. 2,000. The end of the runway was approaching fast, but they were slowing. 1,000 feet. 500. The Boeing 737 rolled to a stop with less than 300 feet of runway remaining. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit. Then Tom let out a shaky laugh. That was impossible. Sarah's hands were shaking as she set the parking brake that didn't work. Nothing's impossible. My dad taught me that. The emergency slides deployed and the evacuation began. Incredibly, not a single person was seriously injured. Bumps, bruises, and the psychological trauma of thinking they were going to die, but everyone walked away. As Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, the 2 F-22 pilots were waiting on the tarmac, having landed right behind her. They had removed their helmets, and both were staring at her with expressions of awe. Captain Mitchell, the lead pilot said. I'm Major Rick Carson, call sign Viper. This is Captain Dave Thompson, Viper 2. I don't know how you did what you just did, but that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. I had good teachers, Sarah said, then her legs gave out as the adrenaline drained away. The pilots caught her and she found herself crying and laughing at the same time. Captain Thompson's eyes were wet too. Your father saved my life once during a training accident. I was in a flat spin about to eject and he talked me through the recovery. He said, trust your training, trust your bird, and trust yourself. I never forgot that. You just did the same thing for 132 people. Word spread quickly through Edwards Air Force Base. By the time Sarah was cleared by medical, a crowd had gathered. Pilots, ground crew, maintenance personnel, all wanting to see the commercial pilot who had flown a crippled airliner like a fighter jet and landed it using techniques that most of them had only read about. A senior officer approached, a full colonel with silver eagles on his shoulders and more ribbons on his chest than Sarah could count. Captain Mitchell, I'm Colonel Vincent Drake, base commander. I flew with your father. He was my wingman and the best friend I ever had. Sarah stood up straighter. Sir. Your father would be incredibly proud of you, Drake said, and his voice cracked slightly. Hell, I'm proud of you and I just met you. What you did today, that wasn't just good flying. That was legendary flying. You upheld the Ghost Rider legacy. Over the next several hours, as investigators examined the aircraft and interviewed the crew, the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished became clear. The uncontained engine failure had sent turbine blades through the wing, severing all 3 hydraulic systems, something that had multiple redundancies specifically to prevent. She had been left with an aircraft that was barely controllable, and through a combination of skill, knowledge, and techniques learned from her fighter pilot father, she had saved every life on board. The story hit the news immediately. Commercial pilot uses fighter jet techniques to save airliner. Ghost Rider's daughter rises again. The coverage was massive, and Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted. But something else happened too. The military aviation community, which rarely paid attention to commercial aviation, took notice. Sarah was invited to speak at Top Gun, at the Air Force Academy, at training squadrons around the world. She became a bridge between military and commercial aviation, teaching techniques that her father had taught her, demonstrating that the lessons of fighter aviation could save lives in the commercial world. Southwest Airlines promoted her to check airmen, making her responsible for training other pilots. She developed a new emergency procedures course that incorporated lessons from military aviation, teaching commercial pilots techniques they had never been exposed to. The FAA took notice and began incorporating some of her teachings into standard training programs. 6 months after the incident, Sarah returned to Edwards Air Force Base for a ceremony. The Air Force was dedicating a memorial to her father, 20 years after his death. But they were also doing something unprecedented. They were awarding Sarah the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors for aviation, rarely given to civilians. As she stood in her Southwest Airlines uniform surrounded by fighter pilots in their flight suits, Colonel Drake presented the medal. Captain Sarah Mitchell, in recognition of extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Your actions on the date in question demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and dedication to duty. You upheld the finest traditions of aviation and brought great credit upon yourself and your profession. By order of the Secretary of the Air Force, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The fighter pilots around her came to attention and saluted. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, saluted back. That evening she stood alone by her father's memorial, a granite stone with his name, rank, and call sign engraved on it. She placed her hand on the cold stone and spoke quietly. Hey Dad. I know it's been 20 years. I'm sorry I don't visit more often. But I wanted you to know that everything you taught me, all those hours in the simulator that Mom thought were silly, all the fighter pilot wisdom you drilled into my head, it mattered. It saved 132 people. You saved them through me. She pulled out her wings, the commercial pilot wings she had earned through years of hard work, and pinned them to the memorial stone alongside the fighter pilot wings that were already there. I was just flying commercial, Dad. Just another airline captain flying another routine flight. But when it mattered, when everything went wrong, I was Ghost Rider's daughter. And that made all the difference. As she walked back toward the base, the sun setting behind her, 2 F-22s screamed overhead in a missing man formation, the traditional fighter pilot salute to fallen comrades. But this time, it wasn't just for Colonel James Ghost Rider Mitchell. It was for his daughter too, who had proven that legends could be passed down, that call signs could live again, and that sometimes the greatest pilots weren't the ones flying the fastest jets, but the ones who could save lives when everyone else had given up hope. Sarah Mitchell had started that day as just another commercial pilot flying just another flight. But when her aircraft failed and death seemed certain, she had reached into her past, into her father's teachings, and pulled out a miracle. She had used fighter pilot techniques to save a commercial airliner, and in doing so, she had brought the Ghost Rider call sign back to life. The F-22 pilots who had escorted her in would tell the story for years. The passengers she saved would never forget her. And in every military and commercial flight school, her landing would be studied as an example of what was possible when skill met courage met determination. She had been flying commercial. But in the moment that mattered most, she had flown like a fighter pilot, like her father, like a legend. And the sky would never forget.